Hi, Kathleen.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
Fine. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and audio podcast. You are Kathleen Ballou. You teach history at the University of Chicago.
Yes.
And most relevantly for our purposes, you've written a book called The White Power, or the subtitle is The White Power Movement in Paramilitary America. It's called Bring the War Home. I have been listening to it, so I can't really hold a copy of the book up, but I encourage you, if you have a copy handy, to engage in whatever form of self-promotion you feel comfortable with. Here's what the audio version looks like. But show us what the book looks like.
Here is the hardcover.
There you go.
I've also now got it on Kindle, so I would love if people pick up a copy.
Okay, and it's published by Harvard University Press. Just came out a couple of months ago, getting well-deserved attention. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Before we get started and talk about the argument you make in the book and the narrative arc of the book, why don't you, just so that we make sure we understand what you mean by white power, the white power movement, maybe we could talk about the most recent prominent person associated with it, I would say, which is Richard Spencer, the person who's getting the most news lately that I can think of, who you'd call part of the white power movement, right? Is that fair? I mean, David Duke every once in a while makes it, but he's kind of semi-retired, isn't he, or something?
Yeah, Duke has been on the scene for a long time, and he certainly was more active in the years of my study. This is one of the places where I have to be a historian and tell you that all of my argument stops in 1995 with Oklahoma City bombing. And the reason for that is that Bring the War Home is based on a very large archival and historical study.
Mm-hmm.
Those materials are not yet available for the present moment. So it's much more difficult for me to make sort of definitive declarations of what is and what isn't part of this in our present moment. But what I can tell you is that in the period of my study, the white power movement was an amalgamation of different kinds of belief systems and ideologies of whiteness, including Klansmen, neo-Nazis, militiamen, skinheads, radical tax resistors, white separatists, and other people who followed white cosmologies and theologies.
Mm-hmm. Now, there is an epilogue to the book in which you allude to the present moment, and I forget whether you mentioned Trump by name, but the idea is that the rise of the kind of the growing prominence of white nationalism during the presidential election would not have surprised us if we had been paying more attention in a certain sense, right? Because one thing you're arguing is there's been more continuity. I mean, there have been bursts of publicity for people who in various senses qualify for the term white power in your view, but you're arguing that there's been more of a persistent underlying impetus than we appreciate, right? And that goes up to the present moment.
Yes, and I think the archive shows us here that what seems new in our present moment is not new, but is actually the result of decades of organizing and strategizing by the white power movement, which we should note was a social movement that connected people across all kinds of class backgrounds, across all regions of the country. It included men, women, and children, and a whole bunch of different groups. Mm-hmm. In the epilogue of the book, I talk about how some of this rhetoric has returned to mainstream politics in a way that it simply was not, it wasn't a main mode of political discourse when I started the project. And certainly we've seen that in the aftermath of Trump's election, and even more so since Charlottesville. Mm-hmm. And I do feel comfortable in some cases talking about the more recent period. So Dylan Roof, for instance, is really clearly part of this movement. He left us a manifesto.
He killed all those people at that church in, was it, South Carolina or what? Where was it?
Yeah, in Charleston, South Carolina. Mm-hmm. And in that case, we have a manifesto that talks about his belief system that's clearly drawn from this movement. He used... in framing his attack, he posted pictures to social media of himself wearing not only a Confederate flag patch, which is sort of a more contested and wider, a symbol with wider meaning, but he wore a Rhodesian flag patch, which refers, of course, to a white minority rule government in Southern Africa in what is now Zimbabwe, and was a flagstone issue for white power activists in the 80s, but that was never a thing during Dylan Roof's lifetime. So here we see that he's really clearly involved in this older history. That's sort of a special case in terms of how much you can draw forward my analysis.
Mm-hmm. And so as for Spencer himself, I mean, just kind of scanning his beliefs as I understand them, I assume he would qualify for your definition. Or do you for as a part of the white power movement? I mean, he hasn't advocated violence.
Well, I think. Well, so again, I won't get specifically into
Okay.
I haven't studied his writings at the level that I've studied the people that I write about in this book.
Okay.
But I think that what I can tell you is that this history shows us that there is no white nationalism that is nonviolent. This is one of the reasons I like the terminology white power rather than white nationalism. When we say nationalism, what most people think about, and certainly what the general public thinks about, is the category of the nation, right? We assume that the nation is going to be the United States. But for these activists, the nation is not the United States. The nation is a transnational racial nation that people imagine fulfilling through. I've never seen a proposal that didn't involve some violent mechanism, whether it is marching people out of a certain terrain, seizing a homeland and defending it, or gradually taking over the world. All of those are real strategies that were brought up by this movement and pursued in real life by people over decades in the time that I write about.
Right. And I should say, when I say that Richard Spencer hasn't advocated violence, an important footnote is that I actually don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know that he's never advocated violence. What I had in mind was that he describes the kind of ethnic cleansing he favors as, quote, peaceful ethnic cleansing. Now, I don't know how you do that without physical coercion. That would seem pretty close to violence, but that aside, that's his claim. Whereas some of the people you write about in the book, they're we're going to blow people up and kill people. I mean, you talk about Timothy McVeigh, as you said, the Oklahoma City bombing. But in any event, you certainly are arguing, as you say, that seemingly disparate elements have important unifying themes. So whether it's the group called the Order or Aryan Nations or the old Ku Klux Klan or these various groups are ultimately bound by a kind of common purpose, even if they differ on specific tactics and even detailed aspirations, right?
Right. Well, and that real people are moving through all of these groups over time. So they're not static belief systems. And I think that's one place where scholars and journalists have often failed to describe the movement as it was really happening. People want to sort people, of course. It's a very human thing to want to make a definition for what is a skinhead, and it's this column. What is a neo-Nazi, and it's this column. But actually, people are moving through all of these groups over the course of the movement. And one thing that a historical and archival approach lets us do is look not only at rhetoric and symbols, but actually at the lived actions of people over time. And what that reveals is this cohesive movement with very flexible and opportunistic belief systems that was able to mobilize people in this way. Now, thinking about peaceful ethnic cleansing, and also about, quote unquote, I should say, peaceful ethnic cleansing, and also about the idea of, so there, again, what seems new is not new. I mean, the idea of someone dressing in a way that is more palatable, whether it is polo shirts and khakis or a suit, that's right out of the David Duke playbook. He pioneered that in the 1970s, and that was all about a better educated, more genteel Klan. He would say, people in that moment would say that they were racialists rather than racist, or separatists rather than segregationists, to sort of get around popular opinion, right? That in the period of my study matched the machinations of a well-organized and highly armed underground, so that the public-facing part of that activism was always matched by a concurrent surge in paramilitary activity that had real body count. So that's where I don't have what I would need to know if that's happening now in terms of surveillance documents, newspaper coverage, undercover reporting. A lot of early ethnographies started to reveal this. And then the ephemera of the people themselves. I think that to tell that story, you would need to speak many languages and have some familiarity with computer programming that I just don't have. I hope somebody goes and writes that book. There's a graduate student out there who speaks German and Russian and is really great at computer coding and wants to look into this. Please write me.
Okay. Yeah. So sometimes you're saying sometimes there is a paramilitary dimension that's not evident, and so people don't make the connection between maybe violent aspirations and white power the way they might. It can also work the other way in the sense that I think, as I recall, you say that Timothy McVeigh, not enough emphasis, he, of course, did the Oklahoma City bombing in 95. I think you say that not enough emphasis was put on the white power aspect of his political identity. But there was, as I recall, there was a lot of emphasis on the militia part. And there was, but I think I agree with you, because just as I dimly recall, these militias, I mean, first of all, it was like suddenly everyone was talking about these militias because we discovered that he had been circulating through this subculture of militias. Right. And we didn't know who they were. But the reporting did not emphasize, I don't know whether rightly or wrongly, I don't think it emphasized, segregationist or white power associations with the militia. I recall them emphasizing that the militia there was an anti-government vibe, obviously. The federal office building wasn't randomly selected by McVeigh, but also the survivalist aspect. These were survivalists, right? And that got a whole lot of play. The racial thing, I don't think did get a lot of play.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, because the extent to which the survivalism of this movement is about their racism is actually really important. A lot of the people that I write about believed that the end was at hand, but for them, the apocalypse was equal parts about the fear of racial annihilation and the fear of the end of the world. Those things are together in this movement. Again, with the militia movement, I think that's a case where people are wanting to make some clear divisions between two moments. And this appeared even in very good journalistic coverage at the time. That there was a difference between the paramilitary movements that I look at in the 1980s and the militias of the early 90s. And sometimes that slippage is even bigger, and people talk about the militias as rising up in 1995, right, with the Oklahoma City bombing itself. But actually, the FBI documents show that the militias were active in the Northwest at least as early as 1989. Generally, the FBI doesn't notice right when something starts. So I would assume that it's a little earlier than that. And in that time, they documented people going to white power meetings at Aryan nations, talking about militias, and then showing up at the militia the next year, right? So there's a really clear outgrowth. I don't think it's so simple as simply saying that the militias are the white power movement. I think the militia movement was larger. I think it was slightly more heterogeneous in the sense that not all of it was overtly racialized in the same way. But I do think a lot of people who were in the white power movement were also in the militia movement. So thinking about those things as two broken pieces, I think is a historical mistake.
Okay.
It's one of those things that, sometimes as a historian, you can get caught up in this sense of arguing over tiny things that don't seem to be very important to other people. And we will go back and forth about like how to periodize something. When does something really start and end? This is a debate we have all the time about all kinds of different historical events. But in this case, how you periodize white power is really, really important, because if you do it wrong, it misses things and obscures things that are absolutely vital to our public discourse. For instance, people often talk about the white power movement going online in 1995 after the Oklahoma City bombing. That's when the first major internet website went up, Stormfront. But white power activists were using computer message boards as early as 1983-84. They were buying computers with stolen money and distributing them to groups across the country. Basically, the white power movement was pioneering social network activism before any of us had ever even, dreamed of Facebook. So if you give them another 10 years of thinking about and using and refining these methods, you can see how this becomes not just like an accidental, not to go too far into the present, it's not like an accidental 4chan Reddit moment. It's a thing that's been building for decades by people who know how to do it. And I think that really changes how we see the gravity of this kind of activism.
Okay. So let's start at kind of the beginning of your narrative, and we should maybe at this point be a little more explicit about the part of your title that reflects a big part of your thesis. So bring the war home. You're arguing that there's a closer connection than people realize between the white power movement and American military involvement, including the Vietnam War, also the Persian Gulf War. McVeigh had been in the Persian Gulf War, right? Timothy McVeigh had been in the Persian Gulf War. And it has more than one dimension. It isn't just that people who served in these wars come back with guns. There's a lot of, or knowing how to use guns. There's a lot to it. So why don't we start with Vietnam, which I gather is not just where you happen to pick up the story, but you think is really an important threshold in the development of the movement. Obviously, the KKK had gone way back, but Vietnam, and particularly you focus on a guy named Louis Beam, who I think was one of the pioneers of this kind of pre-World Wide Web use of networking technology you're talking about. Very important figure. It's BEAM, I think, right? Louis Beam. So why don't you pick up the story with Vietnam?
Sure. Well, let me just lay out one thing about the argument of the book, and then I'll go into the specific story.
Okay.
The argument that I'm making about the relationship between war and violence is a longer thing. It's not just about the Vietnam War. It's about every war in recent American history. Mm-hmm. And what we see is that after warfare, there is a spike in violence that stretches across not only returning veterans, but all sectors of society. So men and women, veterans and civilians, everybody, there's a spike in general violence. There's some kind of overflow or ricochet of violence of warfare that impacts the home front.
Now, this happens like after the wars end, generally?
After the end.
There's just an echo of violence on the domestic front.
Yes.
Is it of a particular character? Does it include like spousal abuse and crime? Robbing stores and killing? It's kind of.
I'll have to look at what's included in that statistic. I know it includes political violence. I think it also includes general crime. I would have to go and look. That's in Burke. If people would like the citation, I'm happy to send it. And you can post it.
Okay.
So it's not just that veterans come home and repeat something. It's not just as simple as Rambo, right? Like it's not just a person that can't be turned away from doing violent activism. I think for this movement, the Vietnam War allowed the creation of a narrative about government betrayal, violence, meaning, the nearness of apocalypse, all of these things together in one belief system that allowed people to band together across different factions.
And by government betrayal, you mean like the government wouldn't let them fight the war and win it, and then they come home and they're not appreciated and people spit on them and all that whole set of like, we weren't allowed to be true soldiers and appreciated as such.
Exactly. And now that narrative is not just, as you know, not just in the white power movement by any stretch. That is the rising narrative of the Vietnam War that historians have argued has really taken hold by the early 1980s, that it's sort of the trope of Vietnam that we know from movies and memoirs and everything else about the war in our culture now. So I think what happens with Louis Beam is that he was able to really use that story in a very compelling way to bring together people that couldn't get in the same room before. So Beam
he was a decorated veteran of Vietnam, right? He had really been really in the action.
Yeah. Beam had served in Germany and then had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a gunner on a Huey helicopter. And he wrote a whole bunch of essays about his time there at multiple points in his life. He was a prolific writer, a prolific public speaker. The archive on him is huge, which means that there's a lot of real information in addition to what he has said about himself, which are 2 different sort of data points. The title of my book comes from an essay of his that was published in a collection called Essays of a Klansman, which was printed at the Aryan Nations compound in Idaho in 1983 and then reissued in 1989. And in that essay, what Beam is asking is for people to bring it on home, bring home the war. He says something like, let those of us, I'm not going to be able to do this from memory, I don't think, but it's something like, let those of us who fought, show them, let the fallen let the people on the home front experience what the fallen have experienced, basically.
Mm.
So the idea is like all of the people who he sees as betrayers, which for him includes, I mean, everyone from the government to the media to movie stars to journalists and professors to communists everywhere. Let all of these people who don't understand this traumatic event experience it for themselves by our bringing the war home to them. Now, that idea of bringing the war home is also not unique to the white power movement. We see similar things in rhetoric on the left, in paramilitary groups on the left, in art, in Vietnam veterans against the war. There's a whole lot of talk about this gulf at this historical moment between the experience of combat and the experience of the home front. And even though it's a war that is on television and in people's living rooms for the first time, it's also a war that is very far away. It's not fought as a shared civil project. It has sort of dubious morality. It has sort of an increasingly complicated process of return, as you've talked about. And there's a bunch of other things about it that are alienating from the structure of combat all the way on through to how veterans come back.
Yeah. Now, so you can see why they're alienated from the government. I mean, I'm not necessarily validating the grievance, but you see where the grievance comes from.
Sure.
It might be less obvious why it would have this racist dimension. Sometimes, I mean, of course, the troops were integrated in Vietnam, but sometimes combat has a unifying effect on multi-ethnic combatants.
Sure, it does. And it's also an incubator for all kinds of leftist social movements and other kinds of politics. I mean, I think that, well, and this is what's really compelling about Louis Beam as a writer. And when you teach this to undergraduates, this is the first thing that they notice, is that he's making a case for sort of the wrongness of war. War is a moral injury, both to the fabric